Hello, I'm Leigh Hatcher from HammondCare Public Affairs in conversation with Professor John Swinton, Professor in Practical Theology and Pastoral Care in the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. John is also working with HammondCare on spirituality and spiritual practice relating to older people, particularly those living with dementia. John, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
It's great to see you again. Can we begin with an overview of your work life, beginning with nursing through to academia? Why nursing in the first place?
Well, no reason whatsoever. When I left school, I worked for what was called the Marine Laboratories in Aberdeen, so I was a scientist. And I used to go diving and do all sorts of things. But I got really, really bored with it. And in fact, I got so bored that I got sacked in the end. And so I had nothing to do. So I drove a van for a little while. And you know, that was probably the best job I've ever had. It's great because you just get up in the morning, you jump in the van, you do your thing, and then you come home at night. Yeah. So it was great. So I could have done that forever. But then one of my good friends became a nurse. And I thought, oh, why don't I become a nurse? And that was the beginning of my nursing career.
But you stuck with it for 16 years.
I stuck with it for 16 years. I loved it. Yeah. So I didn't leave it because I was unhappy. I just left it because it was time to do something different.
What did you love about it?
Well, because I worked with people with mental health problems, people with intellectual disabilities, people who kind of see the world a little bit different. And it taught me how to see the world a little bit differently. So I just liked hanging around with people who society puts on the margins because you learn things.
Yeah. Why academia then?
Why academia? Well, originally when I went to study theology, I thought I was going to become a chaplain. I thought that was what my vocation was. My father was a chaplain, and clearly chaplaincy is genetic. And so I decided that that's what I wanted to do. So I went to university, and as soon as I started my degree program, I knew I wanted to teach practical theology. But I still had a vocation or a call into ministry. So I finished my ordination training, and I worked for a little while as a chaplain. And then I got a job in practical theology pretty well straight away. My first job was in Glasgow. And we never moved into Glasgow. I commuted for a while. And then almost the day that I got to Glasgow, a job came up in Aberdeen. And so I applied for that. You can imagine how happy Glasgow were with me. They were delighted. So I applied for that and I got it. And that's where I've been ever since.
And you've developed quite a specialty in spiritual care. How responsive, how engaged do you think the medical world is with that notion of spiritual care beyond the physical?
I think you'll find that nurses tend to engage with it quite significantly. So if you look at the literature, most of the literature on spirituality and health comes out of nursing, most of it, not all of it. Medicine's a little bit more complicated because it sits in a different place within the hierarchy within any kind of health service. It's much more oriented towards science, and so therefore the idea that this kind of more, I don't know, not mysterious, but more existential, relational-based way of looking at the world is difficult for a scientific mind to see sometimes, just simply because that's the way you're shaped and formed, not because there's anything wrong with science. But it's like any other theory, it lets you see some things very, very clearly, but in seeing some things very, very clearly, you miss other things.
Can you define for us how you view spiritual care? What is it, and what's it going to look like in practice?
Well, I think I would define spiritual care as learning to tell different stories about illness and human distress. So the way that we make sense of the world is by telling stories about the world. And within our culture, these stories kind of stack up to give us what we might call our worldview, our way of seeing the world. And the way that we see the world determines the way we respond to the world. And so in a highly medicalised culture like ours, where science is understood to be one of the primary ways, maybe perhaps the primary way in which we understand truth and knowledge, it becomes very difficult for us not simply to look at something like illness in that way. And spiritual care, I think, is recognising that there are a number of different stories that you can tell about an illness experience. The story of the doctor, the story of the nurse, the story of the illness, but then the story of the person. And that person's always in a community, and that community is always significant for the way that somebody experiences their illness. So, for example, we did a project recently on spirituality and breast cancer, looking at the experiences of people during the first year of their journey into breast cancer. And it's very clear that, you know, two things. One, that initially women see breast cancer in a medical sense. So people in turn begin to think, what does this diagnosis mean? Because, you know, you've got a shift of identity. And so you take on board the medical story. But then the second phase is when people move out and think, well, what does this mean for my life? What does it mean to have an illness that threatens everything that I've ever hoped for, everything that I expected to do, and all of the connections that I have in my life? And the interesting thing is that when a woman, or probably anybody, gets to that, you suddenly realise how connected you are to everybody. You're part of a community, you've got friends, you've got work. All these things you think beforehand you're an individual, and suddenly you realise you're deeply interconnected. And when you realise that, you begin to see that cancer, breast cancer in this case, actually belongs to the community. Because it's the community's stories and how they respond to you that determines what your experience will be. In the midst of that, the medical story is important, but it's all that matrix and complicated matrix of stories that gives you the meaning of what it is. So I think spiritual care has to do with re-narrating illness, telling different stories.
Of all the special interests you could have explored, what's behind your interest, your commitment to those people living with dementia?
Well, in my nursing career, I spent a lot of time working with people with profound intellectual disabilities. And so the way I look at it is that my nursing career was my place of formation, where I was formed to see the world in a particular way. And my theological career is my place of vocation. So by spending time with people with profound intellectual disabilities, I was formed in a quite particular way. And certain questions such as, what does it mean to know God when you have no conceptual, intellectual ability to do that? What does that actually mean about how we understand God, faith, human beings? And so these questions were all rumbling around my mind, and I wrote quite a lot about that as well. And so when it came into, I began to come into contact with Liz McKinley up at Canberra, that interest began to shift into the area of dementia, because it's the same questions that begin to emerge. So that a person with intellectual disability, it's a story they tell of their life that has to do with just being in the world. Whereas a person with dementia, it's something, you lose something, so you're moving out into a new territory in that sense. But the basic questions of what does it mean to know God when you can't really know God in the way that religious communities assume you should, remains the same. And so it's a combination of these two human experiences that took me into that particular area.
And a lot of this is explored in your very well-known book, Living in the Memories of God, presenting many challenges to many people on the issue of dementia. Who would you say you're challenging, and what are you trying to say to them?
I'm challenging anybody that thinks that dementia is purely a neurological thing within which you lose your memory, you lose yourself, and you lose all sense of hope. It doesn't matter where you come from. If you think that's the case, then you're mistaken. And I think it's important that we think properly and clearly about dementia, because dementia is tragic at one level, but there is hope, there's possibilities, and there are different ways of looking at it. So I'm challenging anybody that is fixed in their views in such a way that you actually miss the beauty of people.
Professor John Swinton, thank you so much indeed for joining us.
You're welcome.